A bronze gearbox sits in storage room B14 of the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, tagged for 90 years as a broken door lock. A Danish farmer's plow throws up a golden disc that gets locked in a bank vault for 3 years because nobody believes a Bronze Age man could chart the stars. A dry-docked Viking sword carries a name stamped in its blade that no medieval smith in Europe should have been able to forge. A hollow clay jar pulled from a Baghdad backstreet sits in a museum drawer for decades because nobody wants to be the archaeologist who calls it a battery out loud. Historians looked at every one of these and said no. They were wrong 29 times over. What you're about to see are 29 objects that museums shelved, mislabeled, or refused to display until a scan, a test, or one stubborn researcher forced the record open. Number 1 is waiting in a Danish peat bog. 1. In 1902, a farmer plowing a field near Trondheim, Denmark, hit metal with his blade and unearthed a bronze horse pulling a gold-plated disc on 6 wheels, buried in pieces in a bog. Museum staff first filed it as ornamental scrap, a broken toy from a wealthy grave. Nobody expected a Nordic Bronze Age culture, dated to roughly 1400 BC, to have built anything resembling an astronomical instrument. Then a Copenhagen conservator noticed the disc had 2 faces, one gilded, one plain, and the gilding formed a spiral pattern that tracked the sun's arc from dawn to dusk. Closer inspection under magnification showed the spirals decreased in width from the disc's outer rim inward, a detail conservators eventually matched to the sun's apparent narrowing path across the sky as the seasons turn from summer toward winter. Radiocarbon dating of the surrounding peat confirmed the burial context, and later comparative work against other Nordic sun cult imagery placed the piece squarely as a solar chariot, not a child's plaything. The National Museum of Denmark now displays it as one of the oldest known representations of the sun's daily journey by wheeled vehicle anywhere in the archaeological record, kept under low, filtered light to protect the original gilding from 3,000 years of exposure it never had to survive underground. A broken toy became a solar calendar. The bog kept it intact for 32 centuries. The label took 32 years longer to catch up. 2. Roman excavation sites across Britain, France, and Germany kept producing small, hollow bronze objects with 12 flat faces, each face pierced with a circular hole of a different diameter, knobs on every corner. Antiquarians in the 1700s cataloged the first ones as candlesticks. Later, curators guessed at dice, scepter heads, surveying tools, even knitting frames for making gloves. No written Roman source ever names the object or describes its use, which left museum placards writing "purpose unknown" for over 2 centuries. An admission rare enough in archaeology that visitors sometimes assume it's a printing error. Roughly 130 have surfaced from Britain to Hungary, almost always without coins or tools nearby to date or explain them, clustered heavily in Gaul and the Rhine frontier, and never once found alongside a written inventory or a workshop that might explain their manufacture. A 2021 hoard find near Norton Disney, England, briefly reignited the debate when metal detector volunteers uncovered one intact enough to test for wear patterns, and microscopy showed no scorch marks, no fabric residue, nothing consistent with candle wax or wool. Volunteers even tried knitting gloves around the knobs by hand to test the theory, and the resulting stitches came out too irregular to match any surviving Roman textile fragment. The Norton Disney Historical and Archaeological Society now runs it as an open research question rather than a solved case. Some mysteries don't end in an answer. They end in a museum case with an honest sign, the ink room. Long before any find makes it to a gallery case, it usually passes through a room with no windows, a table bolted to the floor, and a chemist who doesn't care what the object is supposed to be. When Yale finally agreed to let outside analysts near the Vinland map, the process wasn't dramatic. It was tedious. Technicians photographed every centimeter of the parchment under raking light, mapped each crack in the ink, and extracted particles smaller than a grain of salt for spectroscopy, careful not to widen even a single existing fracture in the vellum. The first titanium readings came back ambiguous enough that the team ran the samples twice more before anyone was willing to commit the word forgery to a report that would embarrass a major university. That's the part audiences rarely see. Authentication isn't a single dramatic reveal. It's the same test run 3 times by 3 skeptical people who each assumed the other 2 got it wrong. The Nebra disc went through an almost identical gauntlet a few years later, its looted gold inlay checked against confiscated grave goods atom by atom before a single museum label was allowed to call it real. A forgery and a genuine relic can sit on the same lab bench looking equally convincing. The only thing that tells them apart is a technician willing to run the test a 4th time. 3. In 1992, villagers near Longyu County in China's Zhejiang province pumped water out of what locals called bottomless ponds, believed too deep to drain, and blamed on evil spirits for generations. What emerged were not natural sinkholes. They were 24 man-made caverns, carved directly out of solid siltstone, some over 30 meters deep. Their walls covered edge to edge with parallel chisel marks spaced with mechanical precision. Each groove roughly the same width apart, as if a single crew worked in strict, coordinated rhythm rather than in the haphazard bursts typical of casual labor. No historical record, no dynasty's archive mentions who dug them or why, and no local legend even agrees on how old they are, with oral estimates ranging from a few centuries to well over 1,000 years. Regional archaeologists initially assumed a Ming-era quarry, a routine explanation for routine stone. But the tool mark spacing was too uniform for casual quarrying, and no shipping channel or nearby city ever accounted for that volume of missing rock, an estimated 1 million cubic meters of stone with no known destination. Engineers who surveyed the site in the 2000s noted the cavern's load-bearing pillars were positioned with a structural logic that implied planning by someone who understood stress distribution, not opportunistic mining. The caves are open to visitors now, chisel marks intact, question marks still attached. Nobody drilled a name onto the wall on the way out. 4. Gold pendants shaped like stylized birds and insects, cast by the Quimbaya culture of pre-Columbian Colombia, sometime between 500 and 1500 AD. Sat in South American museum collections for decades, labeled simply as zoomorphic jewelry, birds or bats rendered in an abstract local style. In the 1990s, a handful of fringe researchers held up photographs of the pieces next to modern delta-wing aircraft and argued the ancient goldsmiths had somehow depicted airplanes, even building flying scale models to prove the shape was aerodynamic, footage of which still circulates online decades later, stripped of any of the context that debunked it. Actual Quimbaya specialists were not impressed. Comparative iconography across hundreds of surviving Quimbaya gold pieces shows the same stylized wing, tail, and head elements used consistently across birds, bats, and insects native to the Cauca River Valley. The same regional wildlife, the culture depicted in ceramics and textiles. Zoologists matched the wing shapes to the tail fins of local flying fish and the wing membranes of regional bat species, down to the notched trailing edge that fringe theorists had pointed to as evidence of a wing flap. The pendants stayed exactly what the goldsmiths made them to be. No hidden blueprint, no lost aviation. Just a culture that was very good at rendering the animals it lived among. 5. In 1898, a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Oman said he found a 90-kilogram stone slab tangled in the roots of a tree on his land near Kensington, Minnesota, carved with runes claiming a Norse expedition had camped there in 1362. If genuine, it would rewrite the map of Norse exploration in North America by over a century. The Minnesota Historical Society convened rhunologists almost immediately, and the verdict came back fast. The rune forms and grammar matched 19th century Scandinavian American dialect, not 14th century Old Norse, with several word forms that hadn't even entered the Swedish language until centuries after the stone's claimed date. Oman's own neighbors later recalled him showing off carving skills and a runic primer years before the discovery, and one account describes him practicing unusual letter forms on scrap wood behind his barn. A 2000s reanalysis of one contested rune form, meant to be evidence for authenticity, was traced instead to a documented feature of 19th century Swedish dialect writing, not medieval Scandinavia. The stone still sits in its own museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, where it draws tourists every summer, gift shop and all. It never rewrote history. It just proved how badly some people wanted it to. 6. Yale University's Beinecke Library holds a map, folded and refolded so many times its ink cracked along the creases, purporting to show Norse exploration of North America drawn before Columbus ever sailed. When Yale unveiled the Vinland map in 1965, it was framed as proof the Norse reached the New World generations earlier than any other surviving document confirmed, and the announcement made front pages on both sides of the Atlantic. Skeptical chemists asked to test the ink almost immediately, and university officials, wary of undermining a prize acquisition, resisted for years, citing the risk of damage to a manuscript now worth a small fortune in reputation alone. When testing finally happened, the ink showed titanium dioxide in a crystal form called anatase, a pigment not manufactured until the 1920s. A comprehensive 2021 Yale-led study using X-ray fluorescence confirmed it across every line on the map. 20th century ink on medieval-style parchment, with the anatase distributed in a pattern consistent with a modern fountain pen rather than any quill technique available in the medieval period. The map was a forgery, likely produced to be sold as a spectacular discovery to a buyer eager enough not to ask hard questions. Sometimes the vault doesn't protect a true find from being dismissed. Sometimes it protects a fake from being caught. The chemistry got there in the end. 7. Excavators clearing ground for a new Bloomberg headquarters in London between 2010 and 2013 kept hitting waterlogged wooden fragments beneath the mud of the buried Walbrook stream, on a site archaeologists nicknamed the Pompeii of the North for how perfectly the anaerobic mud had preserved organic material that would have rotted to nothing anywhere with oxygen. What they found were over 400 Roman wax writing tablets, their wooden backing scratched through by long-vanished styluses. The actual wax gone, but the scratches still legible under raking light and infrared imaging, a technique that essentially reads the ghost of handwriting pressed into wood 2,000 years ago. Roman epigrapher Roger Tomlin spent years deciphering the scratches letter by letter, often working from a single legible stroke to reconstruct an entire missing word by comparing it against known Roman legal and financial formulas. One tablet, dated by tree ring analysis to January 8, 57 AD, turned out to be London's earliest known dated document, a financial debt record naming 2 Roman freedmen. Other tablets recorded court cases, private letters, and the earliest written mention of Londinium by name. A stream that flooded a construction site in the 1st century preserved, by accident, the paperwork of the city's founding decades. The mud kept the receipts. The archaeologists just had to read the scratches. 8. Viking Age blacksmiths across Europe produced swords stamped with the inscription +VLFBERH+T along the blade's fuller, a maker's mark found on roughly 170 surviving swords dated between the 9th and 11th centuries. For generations, museum curators assumed it was simple decoration, a repeated symbol with no technical meaning, since medieval European ironworking was believed incapable of the metallurgy the blades displayed. Metallurgist Alan Williams ran cross-sections of authenticated Ulfbert blades through modern carbon analysis and found something that shouldn't have existed in Viking Age Europe. crucible steel with unusually low slag content and consistent high carbon levels, a purity level Europe's bloomery furnaces couldn't reliably reach for another 800 years, meaning a Viking smith working by firelight had access to steel that wouldn't be matched at home until the Industrial Revolution. The likely source, Williams argued, was imported ingots from Central Asian or Middle Eastern crucible steel trade routes, reworked by Norse smiths who understood exactly what they had and how far it had traveled to reach them. Counterfeit Ulfbert blades from the same era show inferior steel and sloppier lettering, some with the plus signs misplaced or the spelling subtly wrong, meaning even Viking age buyers knew to check for fakes before trusting a blade with their life. The mark wasn't decoration. It was a trademark, and it was worth forging. 9. A clay disc roughly 16 centimeters across, stamped on both sides with 241 tiny pictographic symbols arranged in a spiral, was pulled from the ruins of the Minoan Palace at Phaistos, Crete, by Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier in 1908. Nothing else like it has ever been found, anywhere, from any Bronze Age culture, which is part of why every decipherment claim since has run into the same wall. There is no second document to check an answer against. Early scholars assumed it was a game board, a calendar, or a religious hymn, and every proposed decipherment since has failed to gain consensus, largely because a single surviving example gives linguists nothing to cross-reference. No bilingual inscription like the one that eventually cracked Egyptian hieroglyphics. What is verifiable is the manufacturing method. The symbols were stamped into wet clay using individual carved punches, one per symbol, then fired, making it one of the earliest known examples of a printing technology using movable type, roughly 3,500 years before Gutenberg, a detail confirmed when researchers noticed tiny repeated imperfections in certain symbols consistent with the same physical stamp being reused. The Heraklion Archaeological Museum displays it under reinforced glass, still officially undeciphered. Nobody has cracked the code. Everybody agrees on how it was made. Sometimes the how survives the archive, even when the what never does. 10. Peru's Nazca Desert is famous for lines scratched into the ground and visible only from the air, but scattered across the same plain are 36 spiral-shaped stone wells known as puquios, sunk deep enough to intersect underground aquifers, engineered by the Nazca culture roughly 1,500 years ago in one of the driest places on Earth, a region that can go years without meaningful rainfall. For decades, some geologists argued they were natural sinkholes, an accident of desert hydrology rather than an engineered water system, since the idea of a pre-Inca desert culture building functioning aqueducts seemed to overreach what the evidence could support. Then, Italian researcher Rosa Lassapanara ran satellite and aerial survey data across the entire Puquio network in the 2010s and traced a consistent spiral geometry designed to funnel wind down into the shaft, forcing air pressure to push groundwater upward toward the surface. A self-powering pump with no moving parts, no fuel, and no maintenance beyond periodic clearing of wind-blown sand. Several puquios still supply local farms with water today, functioning continuously since antiquity, tended by farming families whose ancestors likely maintained the same channels for dozens of generations. The wells were never broken. The theory that they were natural was. 11. A world map drawn on gazelle skin parchment, signed by Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis and dated 1513, turned up in 1929 during a systematic inventory of the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul, an archive so vast that many manuscripts had gone unexamined for centuries, stacked in rooms that hadn't been fully cataloged since the empire that built them. The map showed the coastlines of West Africa and South America with startling accuracy for its era, and its western edge appeared to trace a coastline some fringe writers later claimed matched Antarctica's ice-free bedrock, sparking decades of speculation about lost ancient seafaring civilizations and, eventually, entire books built around the theory. Ottoman historians took a simpler approach. Piri Reis's own marginal notes state he compiled the map from roughly 20 older source charts, including material said to derive from a lost map of Christopher Columbus himself. And the admiral even lists which regions came from which sources in the map's margins, an act of citation rare for the period. Cartographic historians comparing the disputed southern coastline to contemporary 16th century mapping conventions found it consistent with speculative renderings of a hypothetical southern continent, a common feature on period maps, not a satellite-accurate coastline. The map is genuine, extraordinary, and exactly what its own author said it was: a careful compilation, not a mystery signal from the deep past. 12. A 7-meter iron pillar has stood in the Qutb complex in Delhi since roughly 402 AD, commissioned under the Gupta Empire, and it has never developed the flaking rust that destroys iron artifacts of similar age almost everywhere else on Earth. Despite standing exposed to monsoon rains for over 16 centuries, with no roof, no case, and no conservator ever assigned to protect it. Colonial-era British engineers, encountering it in the 19th century, largely dismissed the lack of corrosion as a curiosity of climate, assuming Delhi's dry air simply preserved it better than Europe's damp weather, an explanation that conveniently required no further study. That explanation didn't survive contact with actual metallurgy. In 2003, materials scientist R. Balasubramaniam and colleagues analyzed the pillar's surface and found a thin, self-renewing passive film of iron hydrogen phosphate hydrate, formed because Gupta-era smiths used a phosphorus-rich iron forging process nearly unknown to European ironworking at the time, one that required repeatedly heating and hammering the iron with specific plant material whose ash concentrated phosphorus into the metal. That phosphorus reacts with humidity to build a protective crust rather than destructive rust, effectively armor-plating the pillar against 16 centuries of monsoons. It wasn't the weather that protected the iron. It was the metallurgists who made it, thanks to a process nobody bothered to test until a lab finally asked. 13. In 1936, German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig examined a small clay jar from Hujut-Rabu near Baghdad, dated to the Parthian or Sassanid era, and noticed it held a copper cylinder wrapped around an iron rod, sealed with bitumen at both ends in a way that looked deliberate rather than decorative. He proposed, controversially, that it functioned as a simple galvanic battery. Most Assyriologists dismiss the idea outright, since no ancient text describes electrical use, and the object matched known scroll storage jars from the period closely enough that battery looked like wishful modern projection onto ordinary pottery, the kind of claim that tends to embarrass a career if it doesn't hold up. The disagreement wasn't fully resolved by textual argument. It was resolved by electrochemists who simply built replicas. Using grape juice or vinegar as an electrolyte, reconstructed jars generated a small but measurable voltage, enough to electroplate a thin layer of metal onto another object, a technique historically used for gilding, and enough to give a mild but noticeable shock to a curious finger pressed against both terminals at once. Whether the ancient jars were actually used this way remains disputed among specialists, since no wiring or electroplated artifacts from the same context have surfaced. But the physics stopped being deniable the moment someone poured in the vinegar. The jar might still be a scroll case. It is also, provably, a working battery. 14. The Book of Later Han, compiled in the 5th century, describes an instrument built by polymath Zhang Heng in 132 AD, a bronze vessel ringed by 8 dragon heads, each holding a ball in its jaws above a waiting bronze toad, designed to detect the direction of a distant earthquake and drop a ball to signal it, loud enough that a single attendant could hear the click from across the room without watching the device at all. For centuries, Western scholars treated the account as legend or exaggeration, since no original device survived, and the described mechanism sounded implausibly precise for the era, more folktale than functioning technology. Chinese seismologists in the 20th century took the text as an engineering brief instead of a myth and built working reconstructions based on a probable inverted pendulum design, a heavy central column that would tip toward the direction of ground tremor and trigger the nearest dragon's jaw through a linked lever system hidden inside the vessel's body. Modern replicas built to this specification have successfully detected simulated distant earthquakes and indicated the correct compass direction of origin, including one 2005 reconstruction that correctly identified the direction of a real regional tremor before conventional seismographs finished processing it. The original bronze instrument itself is lost. The physics inside the old text was not superstition. It was a working seismometer, 13 centuries before Europe built one. 15. In 1999, looters using metal detectors illegally dug up a bronze disc inlaid with gold symbols from Mittelberg Hill near Nebra, Germany, and sold it on the black market. It changed hands twice more before German authorities set up a sting operation in a Basel hotel in 2002 to recover it, along with the original bronze axes and swords buried alongside it. Because the find had been ripped from its context by looters, some archaeologists initially questioned whether the disc was even genuine rather than a modern forgery designed to fool black market buyers, a suspicion sharpened by the fact that no scientist had yet examined it under controlled conditions. Soil residue analysis on the disc's surface matched the mineral composition of the confiscated grave goods exactly, and corrosion patterns proved consistent with roughly 3,600 years of burial, dating it to around 1600 BC. Its gold inlay depicts the sun, a lunar crescent, and a cluster of stars matching the Pleiades, arranged with an accuracy that suggests Bronze Age observers tracking a real solar calendar across multiple seasons rather than a single decorative sky. It now sits in the State Museum of Prehistory in Halle, the object of a criminal sting turned into humanity's oldest known depiction of the night sky, the Basel sting. The recovery itself unfolded less like an archaeological dig and more like a narcotics buy. German and Swiss investigators had been tracking the disc for nearly 3 years through a chain of middlemen, each one adding a markup and a layer of deniability, before an undercover archaeologist posing as a private collector finally arranged a meeting in a Basel hotel room in February 2002. The asking price had climbed past 1 million Deutsche by the time the deal was set. Police watched from an adjoining room as the seller unwrapped the disc on a bedspread, and the moment visual confirmation came through, officers moved in and made the arrest before any money changed hands. The seller, it turned out, had no idea what he was actually holding, only that it was old, gold, and worth more the longer he waited to sell it. What made the case unusual wasn't the sting itself, but what came after. Prosecutors treated the recovered context, the axes, chisels, and bracelets buried alongside the disc, as evidence with its own chain of custody, since a single object without its grave goods is a curiosity. But the same object with its full burial assemblage intact is a dated, defensible discovery. The tactics of a drug bust aimed at protecting a scrap of Bronze Age astronomy from disappearing into a private vitrine forever. In 1939, archaeologist Basil Brown was hired to excavate a cluster of earthen mounds on Edith Pretty's estate at Sutton Hoo, England, work that landowners and academics alike expected to turn up, at best, a modest Anglo-Saxon burial already picked over by grave robbers centuries earlier, since most of the visible mounds bore obvious signs of old, unsuccessful digging. Instead, Brown found the ghost outline of an entire 27-meter ship in the soil, its wood long since rotted away, but its iron rivets still marking the hull's shape row by row, and inside it an undisturbed burial chamber that no earlier robber had ever reached. The find included an ornate iron and bronze helmet, a Byzantine silver bowl, and Merovingian gold coins. Evidence of trade and craftsmanship far more sophisticated than the Dark Ages label popular at the time implied connections stretching from East Anglia to Constantinople in a single grave. Some contemporary academics initially balked at crediting a self-taught excavator like Brown for the discovery, and he was paid a laborer's wage for work that would define a century of English archaeology. The British Museum's later, fuller study confirmed the burial belonged to an early 7th century East Anglian king, likely Radwald, and it single-handedly forced historians to rewrite what post-Roman Britain was actually capable of building. The mound wasn't empty. The century just needed a better name. 17. In 2009, a retired factory worker named Terry Herbert was metal detecting a recently plowed field in Staffordshire, England, expecting the usual scatter of buttons and horseshoes after years of finding little more. Instead, he pulled up gold sword fittings, then more, then hundreds more, in what became the largest hoard of Anglo-Saxon gold and silver metalwork ever found. Over 4,600 pieces recovered from a patch of farmland no larger than a few gardens. Early assumptions lean toward a buried trader's stock or a Christian church treasury, since a hoard almost entirely composed of military fittings, with no domestic items, feasting vessels, or jewelry for women, didn't fit any previously cataloged hoard type in Britain or on the continent. Archaeologists at Birmingham Museum eventually concluded the hoard was overwhelmingly composed of war gear stripped from weapons, likely deliberately, possibly ritually deposited after a battle rather than hidden for safekeeping, since safekeeping caches don't usually arrive already dismantled, hilt plates torn from blades and crosses bent as if stripped in haste or as an offering. The find pushed back estimates of the sheer volume of gold circulating in 7th century Mercia and forced a reassessment of how organized and wealthy that kingdom's warrior elite really was. One plowed field held more gold than every prior Anglo-Saxon dig combined. 18. A clay cylinder inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, commissioned by Persian king Cyrus the Great after his conquest of Babylon in 539 BC, was excavated by Hormuzd Rassam in 1879 from the ruins of the Esagila Temple and shipped to the British Museum, where it initially drew modest attention as one inscription among thousands of similar foundation deposits stacked in storage with barely a translation attached. It sat cataloged and largely unremarked for decades, one broken cylinder among a wall of broken cylinders. Then 20th century translators recognized its content described Cyrus restoring displaced peoples to their homelands and permitting the rebuilding of temples, language some scholars connected to the biblical account of Cyrus allowing Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem. The United Nations displayed a replica in 1971, and some commentators have since overstated the cylinder as history's first human rights charter, a framing most Assyriologists reject as anachronistic, since the text follows a standard Mesopotamian royal propaganda formula used by kings for centuries before Cyrus to justify a change in power. The genuine historical value doesn't need the exaggeration. It's a real Persian king's real policy, carved in clay, that outlasted the empire that wrote it. 19. Napoleon's soldiers, clearing ground near the town of Rosetta in 1799, uncovered a broken slab of black granodiorite inscribed with the same royal decree in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and ancient Greek, a redundancy that would turn out to be the single most valuable accident in the history of linguistics. Egyptologists at the time could read the Greek easily enough, but hieroglyphics had been an unreadable dead script for over 1,000 years, dismissed by some scholars as purely symbolic or mystical rather than a functioning phonetic writing system, a dead end rather than a code. The stone changed hands to British forces after their 1801 victory in Egypt and went to the British Museum, where it became the testing ground for a decoding race that consumed the careers of several rival scholars across two countries. French scholar Jean-François Champollion spent over a decade comparing the Greek and hieroglyphic sections, cracking the phonetic principle in 1822 by matching royal names, like Ptolemy, that appeared as fixed sound groups in a cartouche, a breakthrough he reportedly announced to his brother before promptly collapsing from exhaustion. Hieroglyphics weren't mystical symbols. They were an alphabet-adjacent writing system, hiding in plain sight on temple walls across Egypt for 2,000 years, waiting for someone to read the same sentence 3 different ways. The curator's gamble. Not every reversal starts with a lucky find. Some start with a mid-career researcher deciding to risk their reputation on a hunch that a label is wrong. The push to CT scan a corroded scrap of door hardware from Antikythera didn't come from a senior curator with nothing to lose. It came from a graduate student who spent nearly 2 years petitioning museum administrators for access, funding, and machine time for an object nobody else considered worth the electricity, filing request after request that came back marked low priority. The same pattern shows up again and again in this list. A conservator willing to argue with a director, a rhinologist willing to publish a finding that embarrassed a beloved local legend, a chemist willing to tell a major university its prize acquisition was a fake. None of them had guaranteed careers waiting on the other side of being right. Being wrong, publicly, about a headline artifact can end a research career before it starts, which is exactly why so many of these objects sat mislabeled for as long as they did. Nobody wants to be the name attached to the wrong guess. The 29 reversals in this list didn't happen because the evidence was easy to find. They happened because, eventually, someone decided the risk of asking the question was smaller than the risk of never asking it at all. 20. China's Terracotta Army, discovered by farmers digging a well near Xi'an in 1974, is famous for its ranks of life-sized soldiers guarding Emperor Qin Shi Huang's tomb complex. Less famous is how little of the site has actually been opened. The emperor's central burial mound itself, described in the 1st century BC historian Sima Qian's account as containing rivers of flowing mercury and a scale model of the empire under a ceiling of pearl constellations, remains sealed and unexcavated to this day, a deliberate choice rather than a lack of resources or interest. For decades, this was treated as probably exaggerated legend, the kind of court flattery historians expect from ancient chroniclers writing generations after an emperor's death. Soil samples taken from the mound in the 1980s, and again in more recent surveys, detected mercury concentrations far above natural background levels, concentrated specifically over the area matching the historical description of the empire's rivers and seas, with readings dropping off sharply at the mound's edges exactly where the coastline would be expected to end. Chinese authorities have deliberately chosen not to excavate the tomb chamber itself, citing preservation concerns after Terracotta Army paint pigments crumbled to dust within minutes of air exposure in the 1970s, a loss so total that most soldiers now on display are the bare gray clay color rather than their original painted red, purple, and green. The proof is already in the soil. The tomb stays shut because the last time China opened something this old, the color turned to powder in front of them. 21. A Turkish sponge diver named Mehmet Çakur spotted strange metal shapes on the seafloor off Uluburun, Turkey, in 1982, at a depth that put them well beyond casual diving range and forced professional archaeologists to train as technical divers just to reach the wreck safely. What archaeologists George Bass and Samal Pulak eventually excavated across 11 diving seasons was a late Bronze Age merchant ship, dated to around 1300 BC, carrying the richest and most diverse cargo ever recovered from an ancient shipwreck. 10 tons of copper and tin ingots, Egyptian scarabs, Canaanite jewelry, Mycenaean pottery, ivory, and ebony logs from tropical Africa, all packed into a hull barely 15 meters long. Before this find, Many historians assumed Bronze Age Mediterranean trade was small-scale and regional. Coastal hops rather than long international voyages carrying luxury goods across multiple civilizations at once. An economy of local fishermen rather than international merchants. The ship's cargo manifest, reconstructed piece by piece from the seabed over more than a decade of careful excavation, proved otherwise. Goods from at least 7 different cultures, moving together on a single vessel bound for a buyer who could apparently afford all of it at once. It rewrote the assumed scale of the entire Bronze Age economy. One sunken ship did more to prove ancient globalization than a century of land excavations combined. 22. The British Museum holds a small glass drinking vessel from the 4th century AD, known as the Lycurgus cup, carved with a scene of King Lycurgus being strangled by vines in punishment for offending the god Dionysus. For centuries, it was cataloged simply as an exceptionally fine piece of Roman cage cup glasswork, notable mainly for its craftsmanship rather than any hidden property, admired for the depth of its carving rather than anything happening at the molecular level. Then curators noticed something the color plates in older catalogs had never captured properly. The cup changes color depending on how light passes through it, appearing jade green when lit from the front and blood red when lit from behind, an effect nearly impossible to photograph accurately with older film stock, which is likely why generations of scholars simply never mentioned it. Researchers at the museum eventually ran the glass through electron microscopy in the 1990s and found trace amounts of gold and silver nanoparticles, roughly 50 nanometers across, embedded in the glass itself, particles small enough to scatter and absorb light differently depending on its angle. A nanotechnology effect Roman glassmakers could not have understood theoretically, but clearly knew how to. Produced by trial and error, likely through generations of glassblowers passing down a recipe none of them could explain in scientific terms. Modern nanophotonics researchers now cite the cup as a working proof of concept for sensor technology capable of detecting trace chemicals by exactly this kind of color shift. Rome wasn't doing chemistry theory. Rome was doing chemistry. 23. Klaus Schmidt began excavating a series of hilltop stone circles near Şanlıurfa, Turkey, in 1994, at a site local farmers had long dismissed as an unremarkable medieval cemetery, one so unimpressive a previous survey team had walked past it decades earlier without a second look. What emerged instead were massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some over 5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons, carved with reliefs of foxes, boars, and vultures, arranged in circular enclosures that appeared to have been deliberately buried under tons of packed rubble at some point in antiquity, a burial that ironically preserved them. Radiocarbon dating placed the oldest structures at roughly 9,600 BC, meaning Göbekli Tepe predates Stonehenge by about 6,000 years and predates the invention of pottery, writing, and agriculture itself in the region. Before this dig, the standard model of human development held that only settled farming societies had the surplus labor and organization needed to build monumental architecture, an assumption so deeply embedded that Schmidt himself initially doubted his own dating results. Göbekli Tepe was raised by hunter-gatherers before agriculture existed at all, which meant the old sequence had the order backward. It wasn't farming that produced the surplus to build temples. Something like Göbekli Tepe's construction may have driven the need to settle down and farm in the first place, since feeding the workforce required to quarry and haul 10-ton pillars would have demanded exactly the kind of concentrated grain surplus farming eventually provided. One hilltop cemetery turned out to be older than civilization's supposed starting line. 24. In 1972, an amateur diver named Stefano Mariattini was snorkeling off the coast of Riace, Calabria, when he spotted what he first thought was a corpse on the seabed, a moment he later described as one of the most unsettling of his life before he realized the arm wasn't attached to anything that had ever been alive. It was a bronze arm, What his find led to was two full-scale Greek bronze statues from roughly the 5th century BC, remarkably preserved by the anoxic seabed mud that had entombed them for over 2,000 years, likely cargo lost from a ship transporting looted or purchased Greek art to Rome. Initial restoration attempts in the 1970s used cleaning methods that risked damaging the surviving inlaid glass eyes and copper lips, and Italian conservators clashed publicly over how aggressively to treat metal that fragile, a dispute that played out in national newspapers as if it were a political scandal. A dedicated restoration lab in Florence spent years developing a slower, more conservative cleaning protocol before the statues were fit for display. Work that revealed original casting techniques so refined that modern metallurgists still debate the exact lost wax process used, particularly how the ancient founders achieved such thin, even bronze walls without the statues collapsing during cooling. 2,000 years underwater preserved them better than a fast, careless cleanup on land nearly ruined them. 25. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ejdib threw a stone into a cave opening near Qumran by the Dead Sea, chasing a stray goat, and heard pottery shatter, a sound he later said he almost ignored, assuming it was just another empty jar left by earlier shepherds. Inside were clay jars holding leather and papyrus scrolls that turned out to be the oldest known surviving copies of Hebrew biblical texts, some predating previously known manuscripts by over 1,000 years. Antiquities dealers initially sold pieces off individually, sometimes cutting scrolls apart to increase the number of items they could sell, and early scholarly access was tightly restricted by a small international team that controlled the material for decades, drawing accusations that the restrictions were slowing research and possibly hiding contents that complicated accepted religious history. Public pressure in the 1990s finally forced full photographic publication of every fragment, ending a monopoly on access that had lasted almost as long as the scrolls themselves had been buried. Later, multispectral imaging and DNA testing of the parchment itself confirmed the scroll's authenticity and helped researchers match torn fragments from different jars back to single original scrolls, in some cases reuniting pieces that had been separated for over 1,000 years and sold to different private collectors in the intervening decades. A shepherd's stray goat led to the biggest textual find in biblical archaeology. A committee's caution nearly kept the world from reading it for another generation. 26. Mount Vesuvius buried the Roman town of Herculaneum in 79 AD, and with it, the library of the Villa dei Papiri, whose scrolls survived the eruption only because pyroclastic heat carbonized them into fragile black cylinders of ash-like carbon rather than incinerating them outright, a narrow survival window of temperature that preserved the shape of the writing while destroying its readability by ordinary means. Excavators in the 1750s found roughly 1,800 of these carbonized scrolls, and, for over 2 centuries, any attempt to physically unroll one shattered it into unreadable flakes, a failure rate high enough that early conservators eventually stopped trying altogether rather than keep destroying the collection. Conservators eventually locked the vast majority away entirely, unopened, judging total preservation better than destructive access, a decision that effectively froze an entire library in a state of permanent, unread potential. Classicist Brent Seals and his team spent years developing a virtual unwrapping process using X-ray phase contrast tomography and machine learning, scanning the internal carbon layers of a scroll without ever touching it, training the software to distinguish carbon ink from carbonized papyrus by contrast invisible to the human eye. In 2023, a University of Virginia computer science student applied that model to competition scan data and became the first person in nearly 2,000 years to read a full word from inside a sealed, still-rolled Herculaneum scroll, a moment the research team reportedly celebrated by reading the word aloud to each other on a video call before telling anyone else. The scrolls didn't need to be opened to be read. They just needed a scanner that could see through fire. 27. The Shroud of Turin, a linen cloth bearing the faint front and back image of a man's body, has been housed in Turin Cathedral since the 16th century and venerated by many as the burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth, drawing millions of pilgrims to view it during its rare public expositions. In 1988, the Vatican permitted small samples to be cut and sent to 3 independent labs: Oxford, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, for radiocarbon dating, ending decades of church reluctance to allow destructive testing on a relic of that significance, a reluctance rooted as much in the cloth's fragility as in fear of the result. All 3 labs, working independently and without knowledge of each other's results until publication, returned dates placing the cloth's flax fibers between 1260 and 1390 AD, roughly 13 centuries after the era it claimed to be from. Some researchers have since disputed the sample site, arguing it may have come from a medieval repair patch rather than the original weave, since the cloth had reportedly been rewoven at its edges after surviving a fire in the 16th century. And the debate over the image formation method, still not fully replicated by any known medieval technique, continues in specialist journals to this day. The church itself has never officially declared the cloth authentic, treating it instead as an object of devotion rather than a scientifically verified relic. 3 labs on 3 continents ran the same test and got the same answer within 1 lifetime of each other. 28. Polish book dealer Wilfrid Voynich purchased a strange illustrated manuscript from a Jesuit college in 1912. Its roughly 240 vellum pages filled with an unknown alphabet, drawings of impossible plants, and diagrams of nude women bathing in green liquid through connected tubing. Illustrations detailed enough to suggest a real system of thought behind them rather than decorative nonsense. No linguist, codebreaker, or cryptanalyst, including teams at Britain's Bletchley Park during World War II who treated it as seriously as any wartime cipher, has ever definitively translated a single sentence. For over a century, it drew every theory from lost language to elaborate hoax to alien transmission, spawning its own small industry of academic papers, documentaries, and self-published decoding claims that rarely survive peer scrutiny. In 2009, a University of Arizona lab finally secured permission to radiocarbon date 4 separate vellum samples and got consistent results. The parchment was made between 1404 and 1438 AD, ruling out the modern forgery theory that had gained traction for decades, including the once popular claim that the entire manuscript was a 20th century con job. Chemical ink analysis in the following years matched the pigments to materials available in that same early 15th century window, confirming the ink was applied shortly after the vellum was prepared, not centuries later by a later hand trying to fake an old document. The manuscript is genuinely medieval. What it actually says remains completely, provably unknown. Yale's Beinecke Library keeps it on record as the best authenticated unsolved book on Earth. 29. Storage room B14 of the Istanbul Archaeological Museums held inventory tag 74,300 for 90 years. A corroded bronze fragment recovered from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901 and catalogued as a broken piece of Byzantine door hardware, restricted from display, ignored by generations of visiting scholars who trusted the label over the object and moved on to more promising drawers. In 2006, a graduate researcher pushed to run the fragment through high-resolution X-ray computed tomography over the objections of curators who considered the piece too fragile and too unimportant to justify the cost, a request that reportedly took months of persistence and outside funding to finally get approved. The scan didn't show a lock mechanism. It showed over 30 precisely interlocking bronze gears hidden inside the corrosion, forming a geared analog computer capable of tracking the sun, moon, and 5 visible planets, predicting eclipses years in advance, and even accounting for the irregular orbit of the moon. Built by Greek engineers roughly 2,100 years ago, using gear-cutting techniques historians had assumed didn't exist until the medieval period. Nothing of comparable mechanical complexity would be built again in Europe for over 1,000 years. The label called it a door lock for 90 years. The rust was hiding a computer the entire time. 29 objects. 29 times an expert wrote fake, unimportant, or unknown on a card and filed it away, and 29 times a scan, a test, or a stubborn researcher proved the card wrong. Most museum collections display less than 5% of what they actually hold. The other 95% is sitting in a climate-controlled drawer somewhere right now, tagged, dated, and waiting for someone willing to argue with the label. Which one of these 29 got to you the most? Tell us in the comments and stay in the vault for the next one.